So the speaker tonight is Mr. Roland Morley, who's sitting there. He joined the Navy and trains a Royal Navy diver with an attachment to the Royal Marines. He's travelled extensively in North America, South America and North Africa. He did surgical training in Plymouth and Portsmouth and then left the Navy to complete his urological training in Oxford and Wessex. Since becoming a consultant, he's been a Divisional Director of Surgery, the Director of Education, and is presently Training Programme Director in Urology. He tells me his talk will centre around his interests outside of urological practice, including time in the Territorial Army Reserves with recent conflicts and teaching abroad, particularly in Sri Lanka and Tanzania. He'll also reveal lessons learned from treks up mountains, cycling over difficult terrains, and from other sporting events. So, please take the floor.
Right, as you can see, that picture doesn't look anything like me at all. In fact, that picture was about 15 years old and was taken when I first started 15 years ago at Kingston. As you can see, I'm now sitting here with a moustache, which is ready for Movember, for those of you that are not participating in it. So if you want to sponsor me, just go to UK Movember and just put my name in and you can donate. Right, we started to, when I was asked what was I going to talk about, I first of all thought, why are they bothering to ask me? And I think it's mainly because I've known Yvonne for I don't know how many years, but certainly at least quarter of a century. And it was during my time up in Scotland when I was up there with the Navy. And then I just took this topic off the top of my head called Perambulations of a Peripatetic Urologist Abroad. And it wasn't actually till I came up on the train this evening that I thought, well, actually, what does peripatetic and perambulation actually mean? So I actually added two slides to this, and actually got perambulate, walk or travel through or round a place. So I actually thought that was quite appropriate to the talk. And then peripatetic, nomadic, itinerant, travelling, wandering, roving, roaming, migrant. And I thought that actually took my talk actually quite well. So I thought, very appropriate here. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, I know Bill's already given this. I graduated from St George's. I trained as a medical naval cadet, i.e. they paid my way through university for the last 3 years after second MB. I had 8 years in the Navy. While I was there, I was trained as a Royal Marine and Navy diver, but effectively I was a naval doctor. Met my wife in the Royal Navy. She was actually a naval nurse. Did my basic surgical training in the Royal Navy, and then, as Bill mentioned, completed urological training in Wessex. But when I left the Navy, I went into the Navy Reserve, and then I went into the RAMC Reservists. So a sort of potted perambulation. What am I doing now? Consultant urologist at Kingston Hospital, Divisional Director of Surgery, TPD Urology for South Thames, on the SAC, and I'm chairman of our bowel section of female urology, i.e. the reconstructive and female aspects of BAUS. And that has the link, to a certain extent, with what I tend to do in Tanzania and Sri Lanka. Now, a little bit of history, right? After finishing at medical school, but I then went straight to Dartmouth. And for those of you that don't know, your time at Dartmouth is spent getting up at 5:30 in the morning, going for a run round the quadrangle. And it's actually, if you can see here, the quadrangle is right round the outer quadrangle, rather the inner quadrangle. That's done at 6 o'clock in the morning. You have about 12 weeks of that. And then finally, you pass out on a nice sunny morning overlooking Dartmouth, and it is very, very enjoyable. And it's a beautiful place. After that, I actually got posted to Rosyth. And Rosyth was where I actually met Yvonne. Yeah? And it was Yvonne that introduced me to Scottish country dancing and the Scottish way of life. Yeah? I mean, for those of you that don't know, Edinburgh does have a peculiar way of life. It is quite cliquey. It is very much, we love the Scots and we hate the English. But having said that, even though Yvonne is Scottish, she did like me as an Englishman. So it's very good. I spent almost a year in Rosyth, and the main duties in Rosyth were actually sitting there as a general duties officer, or for want of a better word, GP to the local naval population. Mainly those people working in the naval dockyard who were predominantly servicemen, but some who weren't servicemen. Although I was living in Edinburgh, on the other side of the river, and Yvonne entertaining me most of the time, to the better ways of Scottish life. Anyway, after that, I actually got posted on HMS Hecla. For those of you that don't know what HMS Hecla is a survey ship. It's actually been decommissioned now, but I thought I'd give you a potted history of what HMS Hecla was. There have actually been 7 reincarnations of HMS Hecla, but the most important one was actually HMS Hecla when it first started, which was actually as a survey-type vessel. And it was actually the first vessel that went along with its sister ship along the exploration of the Northwest Passage, trying to find the route from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Never quite got there, got stuck in icebergs, etc., but actually did a lot of geographical work in actually being able to achieve what it wanted to achieve, and then set the precedent for future explorations in finding that Northwest Passage. I didn't know this till I researched it a couple of weeks ago. And then there were a number of minor reincarnations of HMS Hecla, and then its next most important one was actually as a destroyer during the Second World War, and it was famous for actually being torpedoed by a U-boat in 1942. And then the final reincarnation of HMS Hecla was this one here, which was the one I was actually posted on. Now, what did a survey ship do? Basically, it pottered all the way up and down the Atlantic, surveying deep depths. And basically, it was surveying deep depths for submarines. Because basically, you've got to hide your submarines somewhere. So these survey ships are actually trying to find out where we could hide our submarines. Why was I posted on HMS Hecla? Well, the reason I was actually posted on HMS Hecla is because I trained as a Royal Navy diver while I was in the Navy. And in fact, straight after coming out of Dartmouth, I went on to Navy diver training. There are 2 types of Navy divers. You can either do a closed breathing, which are the mine clearance divers, which I didn't do, or the ship's divers, which I did do. And the ship's divers are those ones that basically, when a ship's in port or when it's in a potential area of conflict, are the ones that go on the bottom of the ships, check the bottom of the ships, make sure no mines have been laid, and if they have, just get rid of them. So not really like your American SEALs, but not bad and not good, and pretty good. But the nice thing about being on HMS Hecla is the number of places I went to. I visited first visit was actually to Lomé in Togo, then the Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, and also Nigeria. The second trip was out to Bermuda via St. Helena, but also Madeira. And then on the way we went out to Washington, Norfolk, Charleston, and then down into Brazil, into Rio de Janeiro, and finally into Uruguay. What did I actually do at sea? Well, you're a medical officer, but actually you had to do nothing. And my most famous thing that I probably had to do at sea was actually sew somebody's extensor tendon while I was at sea. You would never be allowed to do that nowadays, because I probably cocked the job up, because you would never train to actually do it. But that was probably the most important thing I did surgically, apart from handing out condoms to all the sailors when we were in Rio de Janeiro, which was just at the time when we had AIDS actually starting. And I started with 3,500 condoms and came back with about 3,248. So not many condoms were used on that trip. But because you had very little to do at sea, you got a number of other jobs. You were there as a marine biology officer, but you didn't have to do much of that. You were there as an entertainment officer, and that was probably your most important job at sea. You had to sort out the entertainment for all those sailors at sea. And for those that you don't know, most of the ships have got flight decks, and on the flight decks you would set up numerous entertainments. The most popular entertainments were horse racing, believe it or not. Just like you've got the Totopoli, horse racing, you can actually do that on a flight deck. But one of the other important things, and I'll just show you something about Neptune and crossing the equator, was water and wine caterer. I knew nothing about wine, and I'm trying to link this talk with wine. But you're appointed as water and wine caterer, and it is your job to get all the wine, all the beer onto the ship at the appropriate cost, at the appropriate choice. And at that time, the Navy only bought its wine and beer from Saucony and Speed. And Saucony and Speed only did Courage Directors in terms of the beer, plus probably one or two others. And the only wine you could get was the cheapest wine. And my most famous mission as water and wine caterer was when we were in South America, was actually getting introduced to Chilean and Argentinian wine. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But just while I was in Uruguay, I found this car. And this is the car that I got married in, and Yvonne actually came to my wedding. But it didn't look like that when I bought it in Uruguay. It was actually a decrepit, rusty old heap. Got it made up in Uruguay. They don't do it to the same standard that you would actually redo a car in this country, but certainly got it to the appropriate standard and then shipped it back on one of our ships coming back. I had to do that on the sly because you're not actually allowed to put personal property in a hangar on a ship. But the interesting thing about this car and a bit of history, it was a De Soto 1928, and it's actually sitting in my garage now, so it's nearly 90 years old. It gets out very, very occasionally. Probably the last time it got used in any extensive manner was when I got married 22 years ago. I'm now redoing it up for my daughter's wedding, if and when she gets married, but that's what she wants to get married in. But a bit of history about the De Soto. De Soto is a company set up by Chrysler, and most of you will know about Chrysler, but De Soto was supposed to be the upmarket version of Chrysler. And when they introduced De Soto in 1927, it actually did very well for about 3 to 5 years. Then Chrysler decided that their other Chrysler models, they wanted to push up market as well. So what actually then happened was De Soto, although a subdivision of Chrysler, was in competition with its other models, and so slowly but surely had a decline over the rest of the years and finally went out of production in the early 1950s. But a bit of history about De Soto himself. Hernando De Soto was an explorer. He made a fortune in the slave trade, and he was the first one to discover the Mississippi River, financing it himself. And so Chrysler at the time were trying to push an upmarket model with exploration and something different behind it. But the nice thing to know about this car is it still runs. I'll probably take it out New Year's Day once during the rest of the year, and that's about it. Now, I want to talk about crossing the equator, because one of the most important things about being in the Navy is if you are at sea and you cross the equator, you have to celebrate Neptune. And so what you actually do is all the people that have not crossed the equator before have to be initiated in the rites and rituals of Neptune. And so you do have a King Neptune, and you also have all the other members of Neptune's team. You have a queen, as you can see, and the essentials behind the rites of of Neptune are to initiate and dunk somebody in water. Well, you don't throw them over the side, but you create another pool or the equivalent of the sea on the flight deck and initiate them in the rites. And basically, all these people have got to dress up in as stupid and as entertaining gear as they can. Now, following my time at sea, when I actually enlisted with the Navy, my intention was actually training as a gynecologist. I know there are a couple of gynecologists here. I'll tell you a bit more about my potted history, but actually when I was due to go straight off to the Royal Marines and train with the Royal Marines, but because Obs and Gynae then got stopped within the Navy and actually in all the military services at a later stage, I had my time with the Royal Marines actually put on hold while decisions were being made about what was going to happen with Obs and Gynae training in the military. So that's why I ended up going into Rosyth and then going off to sea, and then finally I ended up with the Royal Marines. So went to Lympstone, did the Green Beret course, which for those of you that don't know is basically 6 weeks of hard slog. It is interesting because if you do the All Arms Commando course, which this was, you have to go to the same standard as the other squaddies do it in the 9 months they have to do. But you basically have to get to that stage when you go where you're halfway along the course. So you have to be pretty fit along that line. I'm now paying the price because I now can't run. Haven't been able to run for about a year and a half. My knees are falling apart and life is not as good as it was, which is why I've taken up cycling. More about cycling in a second. So rather than having the 2 to 2.5 years that one would normally spend with the Royal Marines, I then had 1 year with the Royal Marines, mainly based in Plymouth, but had one tour out to Norway, which is predominantly associated with exercises and skiing. And skiing is one of my loves in life. One of the things that you discover about doing a talk like this is you discover most of your old pictures are actually tucked away in the attic and you can't find them anywhere. So trying to find actually a picture of me away with the Royal Marines is actually proven to be very difficult. And I probably won't actually be able to get those photographs until I've actually retired and gone through the loft. Now, following that, I actually started my surgical training. And I started surgical training. You asked, why did I get surgical training when I was talking about being an obstetrician and gynecologist? Well, they decided they were no longer going to train any naval doctors in obstetrics and gynecology at all, and they weren't even going to second them to the army. So what I actually decided to do at that time was actually start surgical training. So I started surgical training and started at the Royal Naval Hospital in Plymouth, which was built during the 7 Years' War. It was completed in 1762. And the point I've actually tried to make on this photograph is it's actually built on a quadrangle. And most of the naval and military hospitals have been built on quadrangles. The reason they're built on quadrangles is because of the serious infections, tuberculosis, etc., that existed in the 18th and 19th century. And therefore, they were, to a certain extent, isolation hospitals. So I had my first year as an SHO at the Royal Naval Hospital in Stonehouse. For those of you that may have worked in Plymouth, we actually had a rota that rotated through with Derriford being the NHS hospital, and so 2 nights a week Stonehouse was on call, and the other 5 nights a week Derriford was on call. After that, I got posted to the Royal Naval Hospital in Haslar, which is in Portsmouth, and then spent the next year and a half at Haslar, and towards the end of the time there, actually obtained my surgical fellowship. For those of you that don't know, really in the early 90s with Royal Naval Hospital Stonehouse, and in the late 90s with Royal Naval Hospital Haslar, they closed down. In fact, there are no military hospitals in the forces at the moment, although, as you well know, there is a big medical defence unit in Birmingham, and there are smaller medical defence units actually posted around the country, Frimley being one example, but there are a number of other examples. But you can see that the architecture here still continues on that quadrangle basis. And the interesting thing about the Royal Naval Hospital in Haslar, it opened in 1793, so a little bit later than Stonehouse, but was the largest brick building in the UK for almost 150 years. This is just a picture of the officers' accommodation, so you actually see we actually lived in style at that time. So I trained as a surgeon, and I actually met my wife in the Navy. She was a naval nurse at Haslar, and as you can see, the naval uniform until the mid-1990s was a starched pinny front, it was a starched top hat, and they actually had to wear suspender belts with stockings. Yeah? They weren't allowed to wear tights. Yeah? So it's very important from a surgeon's point of view that we got to know these girls very well. As I did, and I subsequently married one. So there's me actually having my guard of honor with some of my medical colleagues and my best man on the left-hand side. Now, we're just diverting slightly here because we're going over to Kilimanjaro. After I finished my time in the Navy, I then went and did surgical or urological training in Wessex. But what I haven't actually put in, and what Bill hasn't told you because he probably doesn't know, is I actually when I left the Navy, I actually went to Oxford and Southampton to do obs and gynae training. But I did my research with the urologist, and then I saw the light. Yeah? And like a lot of people will say, they say, why do you choose the speciality that you do? You choose the speciality that you do because of the people you work with. And certainly the urologist that I met in Southampton persuaded me that I actually wanted to do urology, and I already had my surgical fellowship, but I'm probably the only urologist in the country that has actually got MRCOG and FRCS. But an unusual way to get to where you are within urology nowadays. But right at the end of my urological training, I actually got funded by Urolink, and Urolink is our college link with third world countries to actually go out and spend a number of months in Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center. For those of you that don't know, this is Kilimanjaro in the background here, but I'm going to show you some nicer pictures later on. But Kilimanjaro Medical Center is probably the second biggest hospital in Tanzania. The interesting thing about it is when it started up, it was totally funded by Europe, and predominantly the Swedes, but also the Dutch, more latterly the Americans, and some input from the Brits. The most important thing about Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center now is it is the second biggest medical school in Tanzania. Dar es Salaam has always traditionally been the big medical school. The majority of medical students still train in Dar es Salaam, but what they've done in Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center is they have pushed it very much towards community doctor training. So the majority of these doctors that go through their training, they will do their basic science within this hospital, but the level of science training is relatively limited. But the practical and the clinical training is very much geared towards getting these people out into the community. So very much towards preventative medicine rather than treating with major surgery. The nice thing about Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center is it's grown with time. It has got the advantages of having significant external funding, and it now has approximately 950 beds. But like all of these hospitals that are out in the third world, you can actually spend 3 or 4 days getting to the hospital. You can then spend between 24 and 48 hours waiting and queuing outside your clinic, waiting for your appointment and actually being seen. And then you've got to get through a clinic of 40 or 50 people to actually to get through the work. And what type of work do we do there? Well, I'm going out approximately once every 2 to 3 years because I've got a Sri Lankan link as well. But the predominant stuff that we actually do is pediatric urology. The pediatric urology is predominantly hypospadias surgery. Urethral reconstruction everywhere in the third world has got a huge amount of urethral strictures. And so a significant proportion of the work that we go out to do is urethral reconstruction, predominantly primary urethral reconstruction, but some of it's secondary and two-stage urethral reconstruction. You've got to remember that because of the facilities that they actually have out in Africa, doing primary complex urethral reconstruction is not necessarily a good thing, and quite often two-stage urethral reconstructions have a far lower infection rate and much more preferable for these people. So quite often what we'll do is do a first stage of urethral reconstruction, and then another team will go out 6 to 9 months later and do the second stage of that urethral reconstruction. The other thing that is big in Africa is bladder reconstruction. As you probably know, a lot of Africa is Muslim or has a Muslim population, and Muslims, I don't absolutely know the reason why, do not like the idea of stomas. And the second thing about stomas is it's all very well creating a stoma, but if you create a stoma, what do you do about stoma bags? You can't get stoma bags. You can't get stoma appliances out in Africa. So quite a lot of the bladder reconstruction is related to the fact that we divert the urine. So you take the bladder out, but you divert the urine to the bowel. It's what we call a Mainz-2 pouch. But unlike the old-style surgery, where you mix feces and urine, with a Mainz-2 pouch, you keep the urine separate from the feces. So one of the most popular reconstructions for bladder removal is actually a Mainz-2 pouch. And of course, fistulas. But I've put fistulas here in a sort of tan colour, I've put a reference to JL because John Laneberger, I know, has just come back from Uganda, having learned to go out and do some fistula work. But what we're actually seeing at the moment is a reversal of a bit of fistula work, because we thought we'd all go out there and actually learn how to do fistula work. But actually, when I go out now, I do hardly any fistula work, because certainly with KCMC, they are actually very good at repairing fistulas, just like the Fistula Hospital in Ethiopia and other institutions. They are starting to train their own people very, very well. There are problems with keeping those experienced surgeons because they don't make much money and they want to go and work elsewhere. But where we are, we're having regular returns to KCMC. It's not always the same people that go out. We do tend to change the team, but generally the team will go out to do one of these things. The theatres are actually quite well set up out there because they get quite a lot of donated equipment. It tends to be equipment that's actually run out of its time, but that doesn't matter. But so things like actually resectoscopes, and actually KCMC in Tanzania is probably the main centre for learning TURPs in the whole of Tanzania. If you go to Dar es Salaam, you will still get the majority of Dar es Salaam having open retropubic prostatectomies or transvesical prostatectomies, whereas in KCMC the majority of your TURPs are majority of your prostatic operations are TURPs. So it just goes to show how things are different in Africa, because we've been doing TURPs in this country for over 60 years now. The interesting thing about it is you don't have your saline irrigation or any other irrigation. You have to create the fluids that you're going to irrigate yourself. So generally you'll have a bean can or the equivalent of a big canister that's been either been an oil canister or something else, and you will create your own glycine solution or sugar solution, which is what you create. Or if it's a saline solution, you make it up and you just drip it through hydrostatic gravity. You don't have the luxury of having all the bags that we have and we traditionally see in the UK. But they are very, very good. And the other thing that's important to remember about this is the anesthesia. The majority of anesthetics that are actually done in Africa are done under spinal anesthesia rather than general anesthesia. And the majority of people that give the anesthesia are not anesthesiologists or anaesthetists. They're actually very well, highly skilled, trained ODAs. And I don't know if you found that, John, when you've recently been out to Uganda as well. The ODAs tend to do the majority of the anesthetics and literally all spinals. KCMC is actually near a little town called Moshi. Moshi is about 5 miles from the main entrance to Kilimanjaro. It is a very colourful place, and it's there. If I can say anything about Tanzania, they have got one of the most friendly populations that you could actually come across. They're completely different from West Africa. And if any of you have been to Nigeria, completely different population. They're not corrupt. They're actually very, very helpful. And the one thing that you notice going out to Tanzania is how fertile the country is. It's a beautifully fertile country. And what you can't quite understand, for those of you that have been to South Africa, for instance, how is it that South Africa's managed to do what it has, but Tanzania cannot make use of its fertile land? And I think the problem is education, education, education. Now, a bit onto Mount Kilimanjaro, because I did my first climb of Kilimanjaro in 2003. The reason I wanted to mention something about Kilimanjaro is because because of a beautiful mountain. For those of you that don't know, it actually is the largest freestanding mountain in the world. It sits there at just under 20,000 feet. It is the only one freestanding. If you look at the top here and you look at that picture there, you can see a lot of snow. Now, these are relatively old photographs. There's glacier on the top, and the glacier is now receding, and with global warming, is receding at a rate of knots, such that there will be no glacier there within the next 10 to 15 years. Now, what's very nice about Kilimanjaro is I just want to get you to keep an eye on these pictures as I go through, because this is basically the entrance to the national park. And the one thing that you will really notice here is how green and lush it is. It's full of amazing wildlife, and the wildlife reflects what you're doing at the different levels as you go up the mountain. You then, when you get up to about 10,000 feet, which is where we are here, you start getting into sort of general scrubland, much more open plains. This is where you'll find wild antelope, and, well, they do have rhinoceros here, but I never saw one. You then start getting up to about 13,000 feet. That's the sister mountain. That's Mount Meru, which is sitting about 30 miles away. And quite often people will go up there as a training run or a training climb before they go up Kilimanjaro. This is just showing you more of the species of flower there. This is the type of accommodation. There are a number of ways you can go up Kilimanjaro. You can actually go in the huts, which is what they call the Coca-Cola route, because Coca-Cola, fizzy, very popular. That's why they called it the Coca-Cola route. And they've got huts all the way up, which is the way we went up. I did go up once before that, and I actually took the hard way up, which is via the tents. I would honestly say, if you like creature comforts, you've got to go this way, but actually it gets very cold at night. But what I want you to notice here is that just again the change in formations. This is actually sitting at about 14,000 feet, huge rock formations, and this is called zebra rocks because of the way these rocks are actually designed. And then you get up to about 15,000 feet, and you can see it's starting to look a bit like a lunar landscape. There's hardly any plants there at all, and then you've just got that sheer climb or sheer walk climb up to the top. You actually don't have to climb it, it's just a hard walk. I've put this picture of Ian up here. Ian is one of our colorectal surgeons. Now, Ian, unfortunately, this was actually taken at about 15,000 feet, so just before we got to the last hut, and Ian is an insulin-dependent diabetic, so am I. And he started vomiting at about 16,000 feet, and we all put that down to mountain sickness. That night, there's a picture of me there, but that night we then climbed up from Kibo Hut, which is at 16,000 feet, to Gilman's Point, which is the second highest point going up Kilimanjaro at 5,681 meters. We left Ian behind. We left one of the others behind because he was still vomiting. We thought it was gastroenteritis. He had his diabetic test strips and his meter was continually reading blood sugars of between about 8 and 11. What we hadn't realized is actually, and it's all there in the very small print, if you look at the very small print, is that the glucose oxidase reaction does not work above 15,000 feet. So what was happening here, he was actually getting a diabetic ketoacidosis, and we then went up to the top of the mountain. We came back down, and we found out that he'd been evacuated out to KCMC, which is the hospital I've been working in, and he was on intensive care there for about 2 weeks, then got transferred to the Aga Khan Hospital in Nairobi and was in intensive care for another 3 weeks. So the moral of the story is if you're a diabetic, don't rely on your test strips at 16,000 feet. So once we got to Gilman's Point, this is the view that you get at Gilman's Point once the sun is coming up. And then when you get to the top, you then start seeing this glacier. And this glacier is receding very, very quickly. This point here is actually the top at 5,895 meters. We were raising money for the Kingston Cancer Unit at that time, and we did raise a significant amount of money. What is actually quite interesting, it takes you from that 16,000 feet to just about 20,000 feet, it takes you about 8 hours to do that. You then get down, you can get back down to the hut on the way down from 20 to 16,000 feet in about 2 hours. You can get down to the bottom and the entrance to the park in about another 6 hours of that. So you can get down in about 8 hours, but it takes you 5 days getting up. And the reason it takes you 5 days getting up is because you have got to acclimatize here. I've then got this summary of all the stuff that I've done so far, as you can see. But what then happened later on that year was the first Gulf War. And after I had left the Navy, I then had a short period of time with the Royal Naval Reserve, but predominantly because I wasn't based in a port at that time, I ended up joining the RAMC with 306 Field Hospital, which then merged with another unit and became 304 Hospital. And a detachment went out to Kayoti, which is about 30 miles south of Kuwait. Now, for those of you that don't know how this works, it is very much like MASH that you've watched on the box with Alan Alda. It is not significantly different. You tend to do 12-hour shifts, so you've got 12 hours on, 12 hours off. There's an anaesthetic team, there's a surgical team, there's a radiology team. This camp was actually within a far larger camp, which is predominantly an American camp, but had a British detachment at it. And the hospital is just like you would see any field hospital. This is just some of the post that you actually see being delivered, which is delivered on a regular basis, usually comes in every 48 to 72 hours. These was the sleeping accommodation and rest accommodation, and we actually did grow our own food occasionally. It's not cannabis. Right, but getting on to a more serious note, how do we actually prepare for this? And I'm going to bring in a little bit more serious stuff about training, because what actually happens with field hospital is we have to do an annual camp, and every annual camp that we do is geared towards training the field hospital. So out of your 2 weeks, you'll spend 1 week actually doing adventure training or whatever you like doing, and then you'll spend the next week actually simulating a field hospital. So by the time you actually get posted out, if you get posted out, you're actually pretty experienced with this. Now, because I had done a moderate amount of general surgical training before, and it was still relatively new, that actually held me in good stead. But the most important thing actually going towards this was the Royal College of Surgeons Advanced Trauma Skills course, because that really was quite good training. And the most important thing about going out to these areas is do not try and be a hero. You've got to stick to military surgical principles. So the military surgical principles are basically get that patient or that casualty fit for surgical evacuation. That's your primary task. So you don't want to do complex vascular reconstructive surgery. That's the type of stuff you'll do back at Birmingham if they get back that far. So you do enough to actually prepare that patient to actually get back. Now, I'm going to digress slightly into surgical skills training, because it's food for thought more than anything else here. Because with the new GMC standards, not only have you got to train as a surgeon, but you've got to be a medical expert, a good communicator, a collaborator, a manager, health advocate, scholar, and professional. Some of you will have retired and not know this, but within the roles of a surgeon, we're no longer Sir Lancelot Spratt, but we're actually got to think about how we function within a hospital. And you're now assessed on your professional competency, your role as a manager, health advocate, scholar, communicator, and collaborator. And when we're doing these overall assessments and plans for our trainees, we've got to do regular educational appraisals. They need to see their educational supervisor. They need to have an annual assessment. And what happens is they're assessed on their knowledge and skills, their experience, and if they are seen to be successful, then get to completion of their training, or CCT. And when we assess these trainees, we assess them on knowledge. We do that by in-service exams, the FRCS, and practical vivas. When we assess skills, we do it by mini CEXs, DOPS, and PVAs. You don't need to know what those are, but let's say they are practical assessments, either in a clinical situation, in a theatre, or in outpatients. And that all goes within a portfolio. And then in terms of their attitudes, insight, and organisation, we do a multi-source feedback. And for those of you that haven't been through it, or those that have about to go through revalidation, multi-source feedback forms a significant part of your revalidation. And then we create a structured educational report. But skills training got brought in because of certain things that were happening in the background. All of you will know about what happened with the Bristol affair and cardiothoracic surgery, and that was a big driver for revamping what was happening within cardiothoracic surgery and also skills training. At the same time, the GMC were looking towards revalidation and appraisal. There was significant input coming in through manpower and potential training issues, and a lot of the training issues were related to the European Working Time Directive and the fact that you didn't have enough time to train your surgeons and or other physicians, or certainly invasive physicians. In the past, the general adage was that you needed 40,000 hours to train your average surgeon to competency as a consultant. Your average time actually spent now is of the order of about 10,000 hours. So how do you give that 40,000 hours experience in 10,000 man hours? We then had parallels with the airline industry, where, for those of you that don't know, if you were to travel on a plane every day, the chances of you having a mishap, i.e. plane crashing, is about once in every 320 years. Yeah? So traveling on an airline is extremely safe. If you go into hospital as a patient, you have a 1 in 10 chance of an adverse event. So hospitals are dangerous places. So we've got to get into a situation where we can actually train people better and actually reduce these mishaps. And the biggest problem we have at the moment is financial pressure, because you've got your managers wanting to deliver within a financial envelope. And for those of you that don't know, we've got 6% reduction year on year for 5 years. We're in year 3/4 at the moment, and people are really struggling. And concomitant with that, we've got the introduction of revalidation, recertification, we've got a commitment to audit, and we've also got Big Brother watching us in terms of the GMC. So what drove skills training forward? Now, it was the advent of laparoscopy approximately 15 to 20 years ago that saw the major change, and started to parallel a bit with what was happening with simulation in the airline industry. When laparoscopic cholecystectomies came in about 20 years ago, it was very much see one, do one, teach one. And there were huge mishaps occurring with laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Completely different kettle of fish from what's happening now. But where this has driven us is towards simulation and controlled training environment. And as all of you will know, all form of surgery has a learning curve. What impacts on that learning curve can depend on caseload, the equipment that you have, which I've already alluded to with what we have in Africa, supervision, prior experience in terms of general surgical experience, and innate capabilities, which are actually quite difficult to define. And the thing about the learning curve is that the point varies with the competence and expertise of the surgeon, and where can you draw the line. And again, if you are teaching trainees, should you be teaching trainees on patients, and should the patients actually be the ones who are bearing the cost or the misfortune of that training? So the pressures that we have on training in the 21st century are that we had traditionally gone through an apprenticeship system. We've got the impact of economy within that system. We've got decreased operating time. We've got decreased costs within the health system. We've got increasing legal manifestations where you can only really practice something that you are fully trained to do. And the problem that we've got at the moment is there's a lot less resident responsibility. So by the time you actually become a consultant, you need to be safe and effective in terms of what you're doing. And of course, technology is constantly changing. And if technology is changing, you need experience and time. And the conundrum that we have in the UK at the moment with bringing our trainees through is you've got service delivery, you've got the training, and the time that you've got for the training and how you're going to train them, and the restrictions of the European Working Time Directive. And the challenge is to devise innovative ways of training within the limit of less hours. For those of you that don't know, and I'll just go through this very quickly, there are certain UK standards for residents in training. And for those that go through surgical training, they have to have the knowledge. And the important thing is, by the time you become a consultant, you need to know specifically and broadly about the disease or disease group that you're training. And you need to get to a level 4 competency in terms of technical skills, so you're competent of doing that procedure without assistance. Now, for those of you that haven't come through surgical training, when you get to your consultant level, or CCT as we define it, you generally have to be competent at a level 3 and sometimes in 4. In terms of core urology or core surgery, you would be expected to get level 4 competencies. In certain subspecialist areas, you'd probably only go to the 3. But how are we going to get there? And what we have seen recently is an explosion in terms of laparoscopic surgery, and more recently, particularly in urology, and to a lesser extent general surgery and gynecology, is the advent of the robot. But what are the disadvantages of these other technologies? Well, with traditional open surgery, we've got 3D viewing and we've got a tactile sensation. With endoscopic surgery, you've only got mononocular vision. With laparoscopic surgeon, you've only got 2D vision, but you've got reduced tactile sensation. And with robotic-assisted surgery, you've got 3D vision, but you've got a limited tactile sensation. So the first thing you need to remember, this is actually Tony Mundy, who was one of our presidents of BAUS, our subsection of the college, who's now in his mid-60s, attempting to learn basic surgical techniques. He couldn't cope with it and he's given up. But generally, age is no bar if you've got a certain degree of ability. And the thing about the great variation in natural ability is that this becomes less important when you're going through proficiency training, which is competency-based. Because in the old-style apprentice system, if you came through and you were a very good innate natural operator, you could get through far more quickly, but often didn't, because of the restrictions in terms of jobs, etc., that held you up. But in a competency-based system, in theory, you should be able to get there if you achieve those competencies at a required pace and time. Although what we are finding is it's still time-dependent rather than competency-dependent. Yeah? But what we do need to do is that when we're talking about new techniques, they need to be, we need to have proficiency-based training with it, and we need the maintenance of the skills. And what restricts our practice and our ability is the frequency of the procedure, whether it may be technically demanding, and the level of instrumentation that you've got. And the problem with skills training in the UK is that the UK has few training centres, it has lack of trained manpower, it has lack of funding, and it has lack of trainers. And we're sitting within an NHS system that just wants output rather than necessarily quality. And I say quality with inverted commas, because there is no doubt, post-Francis, there is a push towards quality. Everybody's trying to aim for quality, but it is a compromise between efficiency, quality, and getting output through. And the problem with the UK health system is it doesn't reward hospitals for performing complex procedures with new technology. Yeah? The refund that you get is not actually there. So what we need to think about when we're thinking about effective proficiency-based training demands is we need effective simulators, we need a curriculum with validated assessment, and we need good educators. And there is evidence, it's not very good evidence, but there is evidence that centres with high volumes of cases report better outcomes. And what now I'm going to bring is a bit of food for thought, because if you are going to create training centres nationally, they need to have a regular caseload, they need to be off a learning curve, they need provision of simulator training, and they need specific fellowship positions for a trainee. And fellowship training within the UK is not well organised. And it's not well organised because as far as the GMC is concerned, training is your training is your curriculum. Your curriculum is geared towards getting a generalist out into the community or out into your hospital to provide the care for what they need. And I've just come back from a college meeting today where we've just reviewed the Shape for Training. Some of you may not have heard of the Shape for Training, but it's the latest review. And the latest review has basically said that we don't want super specialists, we don't want specialists, we actually want everybody to come through to CCT training as a generalist. And that's what the community needs, that's what the population needs. We've got to go out and deliver within the primary care settings. What we don't want is trainees deciding that they want to be super specialist robotic surgeons when actually the demand is not there for them. So we've really got a big change in the training that we are doing going forward. But the one thing the shape of training change will bring about is it will allow fellowships to happen. Now, just in terms of where we go with simulation, we have dry labs, and dry labs are bench models. They're simple and cheap. They give good surgical immersion, but we define them as low fidelity. and the evidence about whether they actually work very well lack effective validation. The great advantage of that low-fidelity training is you can put it in most hospitals, you can learn a specific skill in terms of suture tying, etc., and allows you to get up to a standard before you let loose on patients. Wet labs is the next stage up. Having done the dry lab, you can get out into wet lab and operate on animals. The traditional one is a pig for the majority of us, but we have very restrictive European laws as far as the UK is concerned. We've got the animal rights activists, and we basically have no wet lab centres within the UK. So you have to go to France, you have to go to Denmark, you have to go to Sweden to be able to do your wet lab training. And where the colleges are thinking about going forward with this simulation is as follows. They want low fidelity, i.e. technical basic motor skills, suturing, etc., to be available in all teaching hospitals and DGHs. High fidelity simulation, which is the advanced technical and cognitive aspects within the teaching hospitals. And then high fidelity team training available on a regional basis. The problem is there is no money in the system. And because there's no money in the system, we are not in a position where we can go forward with a national strategy with this. So we do need to think carefully about it. There is food for thought here, but there is no doubt that simulation is going forward, and simulation with human factors training is actually going to be very, very important. Simulation, potentially, if you compare it with the airline industry, is an ultimate test. It reduces surgical errors, it improves patient safety, and ultimately will reduce operative time and costs, because you're not training trainees first on a human. Yeah? Now, other countries have taken these national centres a little bit further, and Denmark has developed a virtually minimally invasive development centre where they've got agreement on basic concepts. They've collaborated between surgery, gynae and urology, and they've had continual evaluation and research. And they tend to do this on a modular system. For those of you who have been out to other European places, particularly Germany, a lot of these training is now comparing on a modular basis. And on very basic modules, you'll do day skills courses away from the patient. You'll review things on CDs and other forms of delivery. Modules 2 and 3, you'll generally go with an animal course with CD of procedures, and then modules 3 and 4, specialities specific, including logbook and procedures performed. And also with these modules 3 and 4, if you're doing an operation, you break down the operation. So if, for instance, you're doing a laparoscopic radical prostatectomy, you will only do part of the operation. You get proficient in the first part, you can then go on to the second part, third part, etc., and then finally finish up. But the effectiveness of this is yet to be determined. The problem we've got now is what is the final product of training? Because we've got Shape for Training saying, well, actually, we only want to train general surgeons or general urologists. What we don't want is subspeciality trainees coming out off the top. So if that's what they want, do we need to go through the whole of this process when actually all we need to do is teach them core skills? But that is food for thought. Now, back to more general things, and in terms of perambulations around. Having got back from Kilimanjaro, I then did a number of other trips. We walked around Mont Blanc. I then went up Mont Blanc. There's not a lot to tell you about Mont Blanc, apart from the fact that Mont Blanc is the hardest mountain I've done. It is dangerous, and it is very cold up there. And there's no doubt that the last bit, going up, is actually very hard, particularly if you take the hard route. I took the easy route, but I still found it very hard, and it is very cold. And then you're at the top of Mont Blanc, you walk along Mont Blanc, and you've got a little narrow ledge about that wide. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, you've got about 100 people using that. So you've got 50 going up one way, of going up and getting to the top, and you've got about another 50. I'm exaggerating, it's like it's 20 each way. But when you've got a ledge with a 2,000-foot fall either side, you do worry about it. But one of the nice trips that I did was Mount Toubkal in Morocco. And the nice thing about Mount Toubkal was actually going to another country, predominantly Muslim. But Morocco, as many of you will know, is actually a very nice country. And they're very receptive to other religions and tourists. But the one thing I just want you to notice about this, that unlike Kilimanjaro that you've just seen, where you've got lush green at the bottom and you've got lunar landscape at the top, Mount Tukbal hardly differs at all. It is like this all the way. That's Mount Tukbal in the far distance, but a very, very nice walk. These are more pictures actually showing you the relatively sparse landscape. It looks like this most of the way. This place here is the final place before the ascent round the back up to the top of Mount Tukbal. So that's sitting there at about 12,500, 13,000 feet. This is actually a shrine to one of the Muslim prophets. The nice thing about Morocco is they like tourists, and it's full of riads, and they are very, very hospitable. And what you see here is a typical riad actually sitting in Marrakesh. They're absolutely beautiful. Very colourful plates. The souks are all very colourful. You can find anything there, but you've got to spend your time bartering. Because if you don't barter, you will get fleeced. And now I'm getting back to wine, yeah? Because I started with wine. Morocco is now becoming a wine centre. And there are two very big wineries. There's this chap here on the left-hand side who owns a winery in France in the Rhone area, but he has now started developing and growing Roussanne grapes in Morocco, and they are producing some seriously good wines. Finally, just the last two trips, which have been cycle trips. The last one was in Argentina in 2012, and the most stupendous thing about Argentina is the huge variation in scenery. It is full of lakes and mountains, and this cycle was across the Andes, but it was the low Andes, so you're going across at about 10,000 feet from Bariloche into Chile. This is at the top as we're going through the top of the Andes at that low area of the Andes, at about 10,500 feet, but beautiful scenery, as you can see. Now, the one thing I just wanted to go with, the take-home message, is Argentina makes beautiful wines. Chile make beautiful wines. If we go back to the early 1990s, they were producers of plonk. They are now producers of seriously good wines. And the thing to know about it is it has its own microclimate because of the Andes. So the majority of the wine is grown at about between 3,000 and 6,000 feet. It is very warm during the day, but it gets quite cold at night. So that particularly affects the way the grapes mature. They have their own signature wines, and I'm going to tell you the ones I'm recommending here. If you've never had a Pinot Noir from Argentina, this is the one I recommend. This is the one you can get in the UK. It's about £12.50. Torrentes is their grape. It came from France, but it's their national grape in Argentina. And Susana Balbo is one of the foremost makers in Argentina, and her wines are easy to get in the UK. Michel Roland, you may have heard, if you're seriously into wine, he's a French winemaker, but he has started his own series of wineries in Argentina, and this is Clos de los Siete. It's about £12 a bottle, and you can get it from Majestic, but it is a serious blend. So it's Cabernet Franc, it's Cabernet Sauvignon, it's a bit of Merlot, and a bit of Petit Verdot as well. If you want a pure Malbec, then I would recommend Catina as being the standard bearer within Argentina. Again, easy to get in the UK. This one's about 23 quid a bottle, although you can get his lesser version of this for about £12.50 a bottle. In terms of Chile, really, you cannot beat Chile in terms of the £5 to £10 mark. They make the best wine in the £5 to £10 region. They do a very good Pinot Noir. They do lots of the other good grapes like Viognier and Gewürztraminer. I can't pronounce that very well, never have been able to. But what is now becoming a bit more of a signature for them is Carmenere. And the Montes Alpha you can get very easily in the UK. It's about £12 a bottle. This one is purely organic. It's my favourite winery, Matetic. And that Sauvignon Blanc is absolutely out of the world, and that's about 13 quid a bottle. So it really competes very seriously with the New Zealand ones. This cycle trip that we've done very recently was done to raise money for the Urology Foundation. The Urology Foundation is basically promoting men's health, just like Movember is at the moment. But what we do when we go out there, apart from try and raise money for Roger Kirby, some of you will know Roger Kirby, others of you won't. He's one of our eminent urologists in the UK. He's been the driving force behind this, his prostate centre in London, but also increasing men's health and awareness. But when we go on these foreign trips, we also do visit local schools, raise money for local schools, and take equipment out there. This is the beautiful scenery that we've seen out here. That's at the top of Table Mountain with ostriches, baboons. I just want to tell you something about Proteus. Most of you will have heard about Proteus. I never knew anything about Proteus, apart from the fact it was a nickname for one of the South African sports teams. But what you do learn about Proteus is a special group of plants. You only find it around the Cape, you only find it in Australia, and you find it very rarely in South America. Now, the reason you see a lot of it in Australia and a lot around the Cape is because before they actually separated, they were very much together. And because South America separated from the Cape and Australia far earlier than these two, you see a lot of protea in these two areas, but hardly any in South America. It's very good for brandy. Now, the main thing about the Cape is it's quite cool because it's on the sea, whereas if you go inland, which is where we did most of our cycling, it's very warm and has its own microclimate, and they make extremely good brandy. You can now find brandy that will equal the best from France. South African wines, these are the ones I recommend. For those of you that don't know about Meerlust. Meerlust is one of the iconic wines in South Africa. Their Meerlust classic is Rubicon, but in 2011 they haven't made their vintage. In other words, they've put no grapes into. It's a bit like first and second growths and first and second samplings and bottlings. So effectively, Meerlust Red is a second bottling normally, but because they've got no Rubicon, it's a first bottling. So rather than paying £25, you're paying about £11, or if you go to the Wine Society, £9.95, and you are effectively getting extremely good grapes. I just want to mention a bit about Paul Kluver. He's actually in Elgin. Elgin has its own slightly microclimate because it's slightly inland, and therefore they do very good white wines. The most important thing about him, he's a neurosurgeon, or he was a neurosurgeon, but his family owned this property. I'll just show you that property here. Actually, disappeared. It's not there now. But he gave up neurosurgery in his early 50s, and he's now started to make some of the iconic wines in South Africa. Again, along the Karoo, this is an up-and-coming winery. These are basically 12 to £15 a bottle, which you can get in the UK from South Africa Wines online, if you like your South African wines. And finally, I want to finish with Sri Lanka. Over the last 4 years, I've been going to Sri Lanka, and I've been going to Sri Lanka initially on behalf of the Royal Society of Medicine. They recently had a trip out there linked with BAUS. The most important thing about Sri Lanka is that it is a third world country. But it actually has in Colombo some first world facilities, particularly in the private sector. It has the National Hospital. Its facilities are not too dissimilar from what you've seen already in Tanzania, but in Colombo they do actually have fairly good facilities. It has a National Hospital which is divided into north and south. It is a very colourful place. It's a Buddhist area, predominantly Buddhist. And what has happened is, like most places, it's been through a civil war, which has been religious in nature, with the Sinhalese in the south and Jaffna up here in the north. So you get very good healthcare around here, and you get hopeless healthcare up here. You've got one urologist up there and 2 general surgeons serving a population of about 1.2 million. It is very beautiful, it is very colourful, and they are extremely friendly people, and they play cricket very well. Generally, our itinerary has been based on lectures, a wet lab in terms of reconstructive work, an operative workshop, but unlike what I've described with Tanzania, it's been a mixture of female urology, stones, and also oncology. And just like Bill going across to do his exams abroad, we tend to go over and do exams with them, and we've now set up a healthy exchange where they come over on a Visa 5 exchange via the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, and are able to work in this country for a year before going back, but have to go back on that visa. And I'm planning the next trip back out there because my daughter, who's a medical student, is going out to Sri Lanka for her elective. So I'll be going out to Jaffna on the 28th of July for 2 weeks. I'll be doing a week's workshop out there if anybody wants to come out with me. And that's Jaffna in the north, and then the Maldives on the way back. And back to wine again, because wine, you can't find it. I went on Jancis Robinson's website, and she said you couldn't find any wine in Sri Lanka. It's not one I've tasted, but this is a Sri Lankan red, which is just coming onto the market. But as you can see, it's actually organised and run. The wine is run by a Chinaman. And for most of you that don't know, China is really starting to take over most of the first and second growths in the wine industry. And actually, the top red wine outside French Bordeaux or Bordeaux varietal last year in the wine challenge was actually a Chinese wine. So they're really coming along. So thanks very much.